James Dean, with his brooding looks, golden blonde hair, and devil-may-care attitude, was set to take Hollywood and the world by storm. But what was the real Jimmy like once the cameras were switched off? Well, the obvious success of the 3 films that he starred in shows that he clearly had a raw talent for acting. Outside of the studios, his passion lay with living dangerously close to the edge. And that came in the form of trying to go as fast as possible, as much as possible, which would unfortunately cut his life tragically short at 24 years old. But the story doesn't end there, as ever since that horrific collision, there have been some out there who are convinced that the Porsche 550 Spyder that Dean was driving that day is cursed, and it may have killed again. Come sit by me and get comfortable, because you are in for a big history lesson tonight. James Byron Dean was born on the 8th of February 1931 to Mildred Wilson and Winton Dean in Marion, Indiana. His dad, Winton, would be described over and over as kind of like a distant father, like didn't really get involved too much. But that isn't to say that he necessarily had like a terrible childhood. He had his mom, who was absolutely devoted to him, and they had such like a close, special bond as he was growing up. Winton had decided that a change of career was in order, so he transitioned from being a farmer into a dental technician, as one does. I'm done with being a farmer now, I'm gonna go fix teeth. It's a natural progression, right? Winton got a job out west in California, so moved the family out to Santa Monica. But it wasn't long before Mildred actually got really sick, and she would eventually die of cancer when James was only 9 years old. And this obviously had such a big impact on the 9-year-old James. Like, they were so close. But that awful time was about to get so much worse, because Winton Dean put Mildred's coffin on a train back east to bury her at home in Indiana. But he also put James on that train alone too. James travelled the 1800 miles back to Fairmount, Indiana with his mother's coffin to attend the funeral that his father didn't even show up to. But that wasn't even the only reason that Winton put James on that train, because he actually shipped his son off to his sister and her husband, so James's aunt and uncle, in Fairmount, so they could look after him instead. And kind of just seemed to like wash his hands of his whole family. Like, he wasn't really interested in keeping James around. And I don't know if it was like a sign of the times or something back then. Like, I'm guessing Winton would have been working all the hours at the dentist's office, so wouldn't be able to care for his kid. Or if it was just that, like, he had been cold and distant to James all his life, and putting him on that train to go and live back in Indiana was kind of like an obvious thing to do now that James's mum wouldn't be around to give him that love and attention. Either way, this affected James deeply. As I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you, losing your mum to a horrific disease, and then, regardless of what the actual intention behind it was, you've effectively been abandoned by your dad. It's gonna mess you up. Even though James went through this, he still enjoyed life. He still had passions, and one of those was acting. It was something that his mom had encouraged in him when she was alive, and his teachers nurtured it at school too. But as soon as he was old enough to get out on the road, there was also another passion brewing. And it came with a certain innate, I don't want to say recklessness, but it is recklessness. James started on motorbikes, and as he was riding around Fairmount, he very quickly earned himself the nickname One Speed Dean. I'll give you 3 guesses as to why. He had one speed, and it was as fast as he could go. James grew up and moved back out to California, where he started off at Santa Monica College, and then transferred to UCLA. But he didn't last long there. He only actually did 1 semester before dropping out to pursue acting full time. But that wasn't because he'd like been discovered, he didn't become this like overnight success or anything like that. In reality, initially, the big bosses in charge of casting weren't actually interested in him, because he wasn't your typical silver screen type, shall we say. And that's because despite the image that I know you all have of him now, like I know exactly which picture you're thinking of when you think of James Dean. It's usually that rebel without a cause, standing there with a cigarette in his hand looking oh so cool. Yeah, the thing was, he was actually ridiculously nearsighted, so much so that he was pretty much blind without his glasses. And he was 5'8", so he was pretty short for what Hollywood thought of as this like strong male lead character. So that already wasn't the glamorous movie star look already with the big old Coke bottle glasses, but he also had dentures. Because when he was a kid back in Indiana, he'd been trying to reenact the trapeze that he'd seen at a circus. So him and I'm guessing a few other kids had set up like a homemade trapeze deal in the barn, but James had fell and hit a post and actually knocked his 4 front upper teeth out. But his dad, Winton, like obviously he was prepared for this, he was a dental technician, so he made James a denture that he would end up wearing for the rest of his life. birth. And I mean, that was great. Like, he didn't have to go through school with a nickname Gappy, but dentures in those times were quite primitive, let's say. And so he kind of had to completely relearn how to speak with these dentures in. But taking that gamble on dropping out of school absolutely paid off, and he got his first on-screen break in a Pepsi advert when he was 19.
Pepsi Cola hits the spot, a big bottle and it's got.
And then he went on to score his first movie role in East of Eden, where he actually played one of the main characters. James then got the lead role in Rebel Without a Cause, and I mean, come on, like, he was perfect for that role. That sort of like brooding look became his signature, and his part in that film inspired teenagers everywhere. And I think that's why he did so well. Like, people could really connect to his character and the way he played it. It just summed up that disillusionment that so many were feeling at that time in that sort of like post-war era kind of thing. His very short Hollywood career would end with his final film, Giant, but he would never get to see the reception of those two last films, as neither Rebel Without a Cause or Giant had actually been released before he had his crash. And I mean, Giant had only just wrapped filming on the 22nd of September, which was like just over a week before the accident. But before we get all into that, there is so much more to Jimmy Dean than just the films. And I mean, there's only 3 films we can really talk about. Like, he only eventually starred in 3 films, even though he made a ridiculous impact that keeps him relevant today. But part of what made him different, what made him stand out so much on screen, was he would just bring his past and the pain of his childhood and his own experiences into his performances.
You're tearing me apart!
And he was such a deep, complex person, as one Hollywood star would find out. So while you might not recognise the name Mila Nurmi, you will probably recognise Vampira. She's kind of known as the original Morticia from the Addams Family, but basically she took her inspiration from a character that would eventually become Morticia, because the Addams Family came from the New Yorker cartoons created by Charles Addams. So the mum of that family in those cartoons, that tall woman with the dark hair and the wasp waist, she didn't have the name Morticia yet. So there you go, the more you know. But Mila Nurmi, she would go on to have her own talk show as Vampira called The Vampira Show. And this character was very campy, kind of like a macabre person, like basically that Halloween all year round vibe.
You know, I've often been asked why I don't light my attic with electricity. Isn't that ridiculous? Everybody knows electricity is for chairs.
You get the idea. But Mila would become really good friends with James Dean. Like, such good friends that there were actually rumours about whether they were dating or not. And so a lot of the information today has come from the book The Death of James Dean by Warren Beef. And this book, like, it talks a lot about what Mila had to say about their friendship, and it gives us like a really big insight into James Dean outside of his like film characters and what he was really like as a person. At one point, Mila, their friend Jack Simmons, who also starred in Rebel Without a Cause, and James Dean would all meet up at midnight every night for like around a year. And they would cruise around in Jack Simmons's Cadillac hearse. Well, Mila and Jack would be in the hearse, and then some of the time James would be on his motorbike in the front, riding the white centerline on Mulholland Drive with both his hands above his head, swinging his hips in like a hula dance. And so, like, if you don't know about riding a motorbike, basically at speed, when it comes to turning, it's all about like how you lean. So as he would sort of lean each way, the bike would tilt whichever way you were leaning. And apparently he was getting so low that his thighs would scrape the road. Mila was not a fan of this game. Just to give you an insight into his take on road safety at the time, still one Speed Dean. Because he had this passion for life. But then there was also a fascination with death. Like, this wasn't just a morbid curiosity, it seemed more than that. He'd record monologues on his tape machine about what it would be like to be buried underground in a casket. He'd draw himself as a corpse surrounded by candles. He actually had photographer Dennis Stock take photos of him in a casket in a funeral home. And so I kind of like feel like that's why he was so drawn to Mila Nurmi. Like, she had this macabre sense of humor, kind of approaching death in her own way. And like, yeah, like on the outside, it looks like he just seems to be doing the most, like experiencing as much of life as he can. But you take a bit of a deeper look at some of the behavior, and it really was like living life on the edge to the point where he wasn't trying to actively kill himself, but also didn't really mind if he did die. And like when he's off speeding around LA on his motorbikes and then eventually his sports cars, it kind of makes you wonder where the thought patterns came from. Like, is it that he saw his mom, who he absolutely adored, just suffer and waste away before dying of cancer so cruelly at a young age? I mean, she was only 29 when she died. So then did he maybe make that connection in his brain that like maybe a quick death, doing something that he loved, would be so much better than just wasting away with your organs failing in agony? Or was it some sort of like abandonment thing? Like, no one really cares about me, my mom left me when she died, and my dad didn't care enough to keep me around, so why should I care enough about me? It just makes you think. Because then there were the nooses. Apparently, when Milo went back to James's apartment at some point, he actually had a noose hanging from the ceiling. He even once put a noose up in the back of Jack Simmons's hearse and tightened it around his neck, telling Mila, "That's how I'm gonna die." And I mean, you only have to Google James Dean noose to see how many photos come up of Jimmy posing with a noose. I mean, even one photo posing with a noose might not be considered a joke, but you know what I mean. It's a pattern. But whether or not it was a connection to his fascination with death, there really was something in his life that he clearly loved. Just going fast. As a farm boy growing up in Fairmount, it had been the motorbikes, one speed Dean. As he moved out to Hollywood and started making money, he'd upgrade his bikes because he just wanted the next best thing that was going to help him go faster and faster. And then came the cars. Like, he just wanted to do the same, just wanted to get them faster and faster. And so what's a young actor to do with all this need for speed? Get into racing, of course. James Dean bought his first sports car, a 1953 MGTD, and started racing in amateur road races. But pretty soon after that, like, he'd got bitten by the racing bug and he wanted to trade it in for his next upgrade. So he went to Competition Motors in Hollywood. It was here that he traded in his MG for a Porsche 365 Speedster. And it wasn't just like James was just throwing money at his cars just so he could be in the racing scene. Like, he was serious about his racing career. He wanted to win. He was clocking thousands of miles on his race cars. And he actually did win a few of his races, like the Palm Springs Preliminary in March 1955 when he was in the 365 Speedster. Before long, he wanted more. He was ready for that next level. And Porsche had been designing just the car that he was looking for. It was the 550 Spyder. And these cars, they were designed for the racetrack, but they could be driven on the roads. Like, they were road legal. Whether you would actually want to or not, like, that's another story. Weirdly enough, a car that's tuned for the racetrack doesn't really drive that great on roads. They had this super sophisticated engine that when it went out on its first race, it won. But it had been developed in secrecy. Like, they were revolutionizing race cars, and Porsche wanted to obviously keep it to themselves to give themselves the advantage for as long as possible. Like, even the Porsche mechanics wouldn't let photographs be taken of the engine in that first race. And basically the point I'm trying to get at is, like, this was the next level. This was the car you wanted if you were a rich person who wanted to get into racing and you wanted to win, exactly like James Dean was. So on the 21st of September 1955, he went back to Competition Motors to get his hands on one. Which, I know when I say it like that, it sounds really easy, right? These cars were rare. Like, there were only ever 90 produced in the world, and only 20 of them were shipped over to the States. 5 of these 20 were in Competition Motors in Hollywood. And so this is how James Dean met Rolf Wutherick. So Rolf had actually been sent to the US by Porsche in Germany to be kind of like the official Porsche mechanic for all those rich Americans that lived in Hollywood and wanted their cars looked after by the manufacturer. Like, they're spending thousands of dollars on a high-end Porsche. They want the best of the best to both buy from and then maintain them. So that's why Porsche sent Rolf out. And so Rolf was based out of Competition Motors and was the one that handed James the keys to one of the 550s to take out for a test drive. He took the Porsche 550 Spyder out for a spin around the block and instantly fell in love, of course. It was a new fast car, of course he was gonna love it. He wanted it desperately, but he also had his eyes on the prize. Like, he was buying this car because he wanted to win the races. So he said, "I'll buy it if you come with me to all of my races and be my mechanic." Rolf obviously wanted the sale, like, that's gonna be fat commission, so he agreed and sold James Dean the car for $6,800. And I mean, it was a smart thing to do on Jimmy's part, like adding in that condition that you want to make sure that this very expensive car is looked after properly. But the thing is, like, now you've got the machinery that's going to get you on the podium, you need to make sure that you're not the one that's holding your car back. You've got to be able to handle your car and drive to win. And that's where a guy called Bill Hickman came in. Bill was an actor himself, and he'd appeared in a few roles, but he was also a stuntman and a complete car guy. Like, he knew everything there was to know about cars and how to handle all of that power. So James Dean was very grateful when Bill Hickman agreed to mentor him and go with him to his first race in the 550. And that first race would be 10 days away at the Sports Car Club of America's regional at Salinas. And James was so excited. He'd actually been banned from racing by the studio while he was filming Giant, as obviously the movie producers, they don't want to risk him breaking a leg or even worse, and then they're left with a half-finished movie and no actor to finish it. But after Giant had wrapped filming on the 22nd of September, he was free and he was itching to get back on the racetrack. But 10 days, huh? You've got an awful lot to do with this brand new car then to get ready, not to mention actually getting used to driving the new car. Rolf Wutherick obviously did all of the mechanical modifications that needed to happen to get the 550 ready for the race, and whenever he could, James would go out with Bill Hickman to get advice on like how to get the best out of the car. He also had a guy called Dean Jeffries paint his race number 130 on the hood, the doors, and the rear in temporary paint, but Jimmy also wanted something else adding to it. He had the name Little Bastard painted on the rear of the car. And so some people say that the origin of the name was because Jack Warner, one of the Warner brothers, used to call James a little bastard. So he was kind of owning that. But then in the book by Beef, the nickname came from a private joke between James and Bill Hickman, who was nicknamed the Big Bastard because he was so much taller than James. So Bill was Big Bastard, James was Little Bastard. And so eventually the 30th of September rolled around. This was it. This was the day they were going to make the almost 300-mile trip up to Salinas before the race started. And so what they were initially going to do was trailer the 550, and then James, Bill, Rolf, and a photographer called Sandy Roth would travel up in James's Ford Country Squire station wagon. But Rolf pointed out to James that the 550 just didn't have enough miles on it yet. It hadn't been properly broken in. And that means basically that the engine in a brand new car, it needs time to like wear in evenly, so you don't end up with imperfections causing problems later down the line. So what you need to do is you need to keep the revs down and just let the engine do what it needs to do. And so you really need to do this before you go like ragging a car around I don't know, say like a race. So they came up with a new plan that Jimmy and Rolf would drive in the 550 and Bill and the photographer Sandy would follow in the station wagon with the trailer on the back so that then they could trailer the 550 home after the race. And it was a gorgeous sunny day in California. Conditions were perfect for driving, and you know, like James is feeling good. He's got a good feeling about the race. The 550 feels amazing. He's got plans for the future coming up too, because he was already set to star in his next film, Somebody Up There Likes Me. And he was also apparently in talks with the Warner Brothers studio about signing a contract that would basically mean money would never be an issue again, and that he was going to be a huge Hollywood star. Like, his life was just mapping out in front of him. Like, that's got to make a guy feel good, you know? But apparently he was feeling a little too good, as when the little convoy reached Wheeler Ridge near Bakersfield, a police officer pulled like in between the Spyder and the station wagon and ticketed James for going 65 when the speed limit was 55. He also ticketed Bill Hickman, who most definitely should not have been going 65, as the speed limit for a car towing a trailer is actually 45. So he was in slightly more trouble. Even so, apparently the whole exchange was very amicable and the guys eventually went on their way. They turned west onto Highway 466, which is now just called 46. And when they were driving up to a service station at Blackwell's Corner, James actually spotted an acquaintance who was filling up his car. And he was also a racer heading to Salinas for the weekend. And Jimmy just quickly decided to pull over, have a chat with him, while Rolf went to flag down Bill in the station wagon. Just because they'd gotten so far in front of them, which is, I don't know, like maybe did he open it up once or twice to get that far in front? But then again, this was 5 p.m. Like, they'd last pulled over at 3:30 when they got ticketed. So maybe they did just get that far in front. Like, maybe if Bill had been going the speed limit from there, so he was going 45, then maybe they did just pull away. I don't know. Because then apparently James was bragging to these other racer guys that he'd got the Spyder up to 130 miles an hour. Bill had caught up to them by that point, and apparently he warned James at this point though, like, you really need to be careful of cars turning in front of you. It's getting dark now, it's 5 p.m, lights are fading, and the Spyder is so unlike most of the other cars on the road at the time in the 50s. Like, it would be really easy to miss. Apparently Jimmy just kind of laughed it off like, yeah, don't you worry, big bastard. They decided that they were going to carry on traveling towards Salinas for a bit. Like, let's just get a few more miles down and then we'll stop for dinner at Paso Robles. They wouldn't make it there. As they were traveling westbound on the 466, 23-year-old Donald Turnipseed was driving his 1954 Ford Tudor in the other direction towards them. And they were coming up to a junction where the California State Route 41 joins with the 466, and to look at it, it kind of looks like a lowercase y. The 466 runs almost straight, so it's just a straight road, and then the 41 kind of like intersects off on an angle. And funnily enough, this junction was notorious for being a death trap. And it was so dangerous because drivers approaching on the eastbound side needed to cut across the traffic to get onto the 41. And that was exactly what 23-year-old Donald Turnipseed was doing. Donald was a Navy veteran who attended college at the California Polytechnic Institute, studying for his electrical contractor's license. But it was Friday, he was heading back home for the weekend. He was also feeling pretty good, like just in no particular hurry, you know, got the Friday feels, it's the weekend. Apparently he was doing about 60, which isn't ridiculous for the highway. So he was coming up to that weird Y junction and he was kind of drifting over the center line, which might have been an attempt to signal that he was intending to turn across the oncoming traffic to head onto the 41. Like, he was obviously slowing down a bit to make the turn, but he was still going some, as you could kind of just filter off if there was nothing coming. And as far as he could see, there wasn't another car coming. But then he saw something glisten on the other side of the road. Surely that's not another car. It can't be. Doesn't look like a car. But it is fast, and it is speeding towards Donald. He slams his brakes on in the Tudor, and his tyres screeched 30 foot up the highway. But all that did was put his car further into the westbound lane, further into the Porsche 550 Spyder's way. And now it's stopped, this great big tank of an American car, right in the way of this lightweight aluminium sports car. Rolfe later claimed that James Dean's final words were, "That guy's gotta stop. He'll see us." Witnesses to the crash say that James yanked the steering wheel to try and turn out the way, but it happened so fast that they never even saw any brake lights from James Dean's car. The two cars crashed almost head on, with Jimmy's side taking the brunt of the impact. Donald said he could just see over his hood an arm fly up as if someone was going to protect their head. And I think this might have been Rolfe, as he then smashed his head on the Porsche's dashboard. The 550 never stood a chance against the Tudor, which was almost double its weight. Don's car was still pushed all the way into the westbound lane from the force of the impact, but the 550 Spyder flew up into the air, flipping 2 or 3 times until it came to a stop next to a phone pole. Immediately, the people who had been around the two cars as they collided pulled up to see if they could help. Donald very gingerly got out of his car, and he was working his shoulder in circular motions, obviously in a bit of pain and a lot of shock. He looked absolutely stunned, completely grey in the face and totally dazed, just saying to seemingly no one in particular, "I couldn't see him." And no one could blame him for that. He'd probably never seen a car like that in his life. Not to mention that this was now 5:45 p.m, the sun was low and it was behind Donald, so it would have been making that, that mirror, mirage effect on the road. And then with how low down the Porsche was, and that it was silver, and that it was coming up pretty fast, it's really probably true that Donald just wasn't able to see it. As the witnesses went out to check out the devastation that just seconds ago was a Porsche, they first saw a man in a red t-shirt lying on the ground to the left side of the car, but there was still someone inside the car. Passers-by commented that the wreckage of the 550 looked like a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and it's not hard to see why. The impact of the crash had pushed the steering wheel over to the passenger side, and it had also thrown James Dean over to that side too. But he had got his foot caught between the brake and the clutch pedals, which had kept him trapped inside the car. So it's possible that he could have been thrown clear like Rolfe was if he hadn't got his foot caught. But he had, and so while his feet were obviously in the driver's side footwell, his body lay almost across the seats with his arms outstretched and his head hung unnaturally over the passenger door. His white t-shirt was ripped and soaked in blood, and it was clear to all the witnesses that he was dying if he hadn't already gone. Someone had driven up ahead and alerted the authorities, and it wasn't long until the police and an ambulance were on the scene. Not too long after that, the station wagon came along the 466. Obviously, the Spyder had pulled away again, and seeing the roadblock ahead, Bill Hickman already had a sinking feeling before he even saw the Porsche. He pulled over and ran to the sports car, but he could already tell it was game over. Bill held James in his arms as he shouted to him, trying to get his attention, trying to bring him back round. He screamed at Sandy Roth, who was taking photos, to get round here and help him. And so a lot of the pictures that we have of the scene are because of Sandy Roth being there. Just as Bill was shouting at Sandy, he said that it seemed like James was coming back around, but it was just like a twitch, like a convulsion, and then a raspy sigh as the air left his lungs. According to Bill, that was the moment that James Dean died. But other reports say he was still alive, just unconscious, as he was put on the stretcher and placed in the back of the ambulance with Rolf. The nearest hospital was almost half an hour away, even with the ambulance going as fast as it could on a pretty twisty and narrow part of the 466. And as if the evening couldn't get any worse, a car swerved into the way of the ambulance and caught it on the side. The collision kind of roused Rolf Wutherick, as he was kind of in and out of consciousness at this point, and he looked over to see James Dean's body next to him with a respirator on. So it's possible that Bill could have been right, or that Jimmy drew his last breath in the ambulance. Because 20 minutes after leaving the intersection where the crash had happened, the ambulance pulled up into the Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital, where a doctor pronounced James Byron Dean dead on arrival, aged just 24. Rolf Wutherick, he had actually suffered a fractured jaw and some really bad hip and femur fractures that required immediate surgery. The injuries to his hip were so bad that he would need more surgery over the next 6 months. Donald Turnipseed, he walked away with only a few bruises and a bloody nose. No one gave him a lift back home though, so he had to basically hitchhike along a dark highway and eventually made it home at like 11 p.m, probably just completely in shock. So naturally, news spread fast throughout Hollywood that one of their brightest stars had just had his life brutally cut short. And it didn't take long for the theories and the speculations to start. And so obviously the first conclusion that a lot of people drew, and that some still cling to today, is that he must have been speeding. Like, look at the guy's track record. He's a speed demon, traveling to a race in his new car in near perfect driving conditions. Of course he's going to open her up and get a bit of practice in. And that's what the inquest found after the crash, even though Rolf Wutherick was adamant that he wasn't. And then there was an original calculation that was used in the inquest that showed that his average speed would have been about 93 miles an hour. They used the time taken from Dean being given a speeding ticket at Wheeler Ridge and dividing it by the number of miles travelled from there to the crash site. This came out to be 107.8 miles, and the time was calculated to be 1 hour and 15 minutes, giving an average speed of 93 miles an hour. And I don't know if it's just me, but that just doesn't make sense. Surely it would have made more sense to take both of the timings into account instead of just dividing by miles or whatever. Like, they were pulled over at Wheeler Ridge at 3:30 p.m, and then the crash happened at 5:45 p.m. So that's 2 hours and 15 minutes. Rolf Wutherick testified that they had stopped to fill up on gas for 15 minutes when they were chatting to the other racers. But even so, that still brings the total time down to 2 hours, which would then work out with the distance to be 53 miles an hour on average, which was the speed limit. The speed limit was 55 miles an hour. Thing is though, this is just based on averages and numbers, because in reality, we will never know what the actual speed was when the Porsche crashed. And you can go back and forth arguing with yourself about this because you'll just never really know. Like, how did he get so far ahead of the station wagon if he was sticking to the speed limit? But then also, if he had been going faster than like 55 on average, why was he just reaching the intersection between 466 and 41 at 5:45 in the evening? Surely if he'd been going faster, he would have probably already been at Paso Robles by that time. And even one of the only interviews that Rolf did after the crash with Porsche's official like customer magazine with the chief editor, he'd said that James was super well behaved on the roads, especially on that day, because he needed to be. The whole reason that he was driving that car instead of trailering it was because he needed to break it in, so he wouldn't have been pushing it anyway. Which then leans towards maybe he wasn't going as fast as the official inquest found. Could it have just been that it was a really unfortunate accident? To muddy the waters even more, there was an eyewitness that claimed that James Dean wasn't even the one driving. A guy called Don Dooley was 15 at the time, and he witnessed the crash. At the inquest, he swore under oath that he was absolutely adamant that James Dean wasn't the one driving. He maintained that it was the person wearing the red shirt, which would have been Rolf. Obviously, Rolf was thrown clear of the car, but James had his foot caught in the pedals. So he'd been kind of thrown into the passenger seat, but didn't get any further than that because of his foot. So I think it's probably likely that Dooley had seen James Dean kind of like leaning over the passenger passenger seat and Rolf on the floor on the left-hand side of the car, like next to the driver's side. So personally, to me, James Dean was the one driving. And then obviously people had their own opinions about One Speed Dean, and some were adamant that the warning signs were there about what was to come well before the crash. There's quite a famous story from the actor Sir Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. It was his first night in LA on the 22nd of September 1955, and he was with his friend Thelma Moss, trying to get a table in a restaurant so that they could eat. Like, he had just landed in LA, he was tired, he was hungry, just wanted food, but he couldn't get seated at this particular restaurant, so they were leaving to go find somewhere else when he heard someone running up behind him. He turned around to see it was James Dean, and he invited Alec and Thelma to join him at his table. But he said to Alec, "Just come here first, I want to show you something." He showed Alec his brand new Porsche, saying that he had just picked it up. His entire life, Alec maintained that he had no idea what came over him in that moment, whether he was tired or what, but he said to Jimmy, "Please, never get in it. If you get in that car, you will be found dead in it by this time next week." While his prediction was out by one day, it still came true. But he wasn't the only person that kind of predicted James's death though. Ray Bradbury, who was an author best known for his short stories and novels like Fahrenheit 451, he met James Dean at a preview for Rebel Without a Cause. And there is a YouTube video of him talking to another author, the author of Logan's Run, William F. Nolan. And they were talking about James Dean, and Ray said that when he first met James, all he could see was this like dark shadow, like a black aura all around him. And he said, that boy isn't going to be alive much longer. Although he did say that it would be by suicide, even so weird. And it wasn't even just other people that had these kind of premonitions. Like when we were chatting earlier about this recklessness, it really did seem like James Dean knew that he wasn't going to be here for long. Because on the 31st of July 1955, there was an American actor, Robert Francis, and he was piloting a small airplane. He had two passengers with him, Audrey Ann Doche, who was an actress known as Anne Russell, and George Meyer, who was a film agent. They didn't have the best takeoff, and the plane's engine lost power shortly after that. Francis managed to avoid a crowd of people and crashed into like a nearby car park where the plane burst into flames, killing all three instantly. Robert Francis had been another one of these guys. He was another star on the rise at 25 years old. So when news broke of his crash, it kind of spread all over Hollywood pretty fast. When James Dean heard the news, he apparently said, "I'll be next." And he was. And yet, another sad but kind of eerie sort of foreshadowing was that Jimmy actually took part in a car safety television like public service announcement, telling people not to speed. And how he'd been like reckless and made bad decisions before when he was driving. But now that he was racing, he didn't need to be reckless anymore. The saddest part about that though is his parting words of advice. Telling the kids at home to take it easy driving as the life you save might be mine. And so after the crash, obviously Rolf Wutherick survived, but life wouldn't be so good to him after that. I mean, he'd been involved in the fatal accident that had claimed the life of one of the biggest rising stars of Hollywood at the time. He sank into depression and turned to alcohol. This downturn wasn't helped by the fact that some people, especially like fanatical fans of James Dean, they held Rolf somewhat responsible for James Dean's death. And that connection was always going to be there now. It was always following him around like a dark cloud, and he was never not going to be known as the guy that was in the car when James Dean crashed. So his life continued, but it wasn't a happy existence. He married multiple times, but all of them ended in divorce, and his fourth marriage almost ended in murder. Because one night in 1967, after trying to kill himself, Rolf had stabbed his wife Doris while she slept. Luckily, he was unsuccessful, but he was found guilty of attempted manslaughter and sent to a secure mental facility. He'd also lost his job with Porsche by this point after he'd gone back to Germany to work in the testing department after the crash. He would go on to eventually die in his own car crash in 1981, losing control of his car while he was drunk driving and slammed into a house. He was pronounced dead at the scene. So what about the car then? What happened to that super rare Porsche 550 Spyder, number 55, off the production line of only 90? Well, it wouldn't be long before stories would start to emerge surrounding the parts that had been taken from James Dean's car and put onto others. The most famous story came from a race that happened on the 21st of October 1956, the Pomona Regionals. So because this car was so rare, it wasn't like you could just ring up your local Euro car parts and get your spare parts for it. And so what wasn't completely crumpled into oblivion, was actually sold off. Basically, from what I can gather, the insurance company took one look at the car and obviously declared it a write-off. I mean, where do you even start with that one? So apparently they paid James Dean's dad, who was the beneficiary of the insurance policy, and then they sold the wreckage to the junkyard. But the thing was, this was still a hugely in-demand car. It was super rare and super powerful. And so a guy, Dr. William F. Eastridge, he wanted that car. Like, yes, the car had been in a crash where someone that happened to be very famous died, and so some people wouldn't even touch it, but he was not superstitious at all. Complete realist, this guy. Because he had a Lotus Mark 9, which was a rare car in itself. I think there were only like 30 made of those. And it was a brilliant race car. But the thing was, there was a 12-hour endurance race where the Lotus put in a phenomenal effort, but it was beaten by only one car, the Porsche 550 Spyder. And so the engine that was in James Dean's car, it was in fairly decent shape, so Eastridge purchased Little Bastard's engine and put it in his own race car. Apparently, at some point, a guy called George Barris got involved. And his involvement is a little bit convoluted. The facts seem to be very muddy and potentially a little bit of exaggeration on this part. But that's the thing, we're starting to get into a little bit of the paranormally cursy side of things, so it does get a little bit murky at points. But a little on George Barris himself, because you might not recognise the name, but you'll probably know his work. Because he was known as the king of car customizers. He was the one that created the 1966 Batmobile and the Munsters coach, and he also had a hand in designing and building Kit from Knight Rider. And so it seems to be understood that George Barris had the car, and that maybe he'd sold the engine and a few parts to Eastridge. Or Eastridge had already bought the parts before Barris had the car. I don't know, he's got some involvement in there. But either way, Eastridge ended up with the engine and a few other parts from James Dean's Pride and Joy. Eastridge's friend, a Dr. Troy McHenry, was also into his sports car racing, and he'd actually got himself his own Porsche Spyder. So, of course, when your mate says that he can get you some parts for your super rare car, you're going to take what you can get, right? Troy had taken the back swing arms and put them on his car ahead of the Pomona race. He'd also taken the transmission too, but that hadn't made it onto his car yet, and he'd never get the chance to tinker with it, as just 15 minutes into the race, his car spun out of control and hit a tree, killing him instantly. In that very same race, Eastridge also had an accident. One of the wheels came off and actually hit and injured a spectator, but Eastridge himself was able to stop the car and walk away fine, other than losing one of his friends in the same race, of course. And so people were already thinking that, is this the curse of James Dean's car? Is Little Bastard claiming more lives? 2 accidents in the same race involving the only 2 cars that had parts from the potentially cursed car. You can see why people are jumping to these conclusions. Like, you can see the logic, kind of. The thing was, while it was the first time that McHenry had taken the rear swing arms out onto the track, Eastridge had already raced with the 550's engine multiple times by this point. So yeah, very weird that it happened on the same day at the same race, but could just be a really tragic coincidence. And then we come back to George Barris, because he's got a little more information that may influence your opinion on whether there is potentially a curse. Because he actually wrote a book called Cars of the Stars, where he spoke about his experiences with Little Bastard, which apparently started before the wreckage was even off the truck that it was loaded onto. Apparently, it fell off the trailer and crushed the legs of the guy who was unloading it, which is incredibly unfortunate. And I say that Barris had the car at this point. In reality, there wasn't really much left of it. It was kind of just the shell. There was no mechanical parts as they'd been salvaged and sold off. So it was basically just the mangled body, the tyres, and the steering wheel, and obviously the chassis. According to Barris though, one night the car somehow sprang into life, changed gears before crashing into the opposite wall of his workshop with absolutely zero explanation. He knew though that it wasn't going to do any good having Little Bastard sitting behind closed doors, and figured he could make a little bit of money from the car, sending it out for the highway patrol to use as kind of like a road safety exhibit. So he patched it up so that it was one semi-sturdy Hulk again, which looked to be welded and patched up with extra bits that he just had laying around, but it served the purpose, didn't it? People could go and see the actual car that James Dean had died in. kind of send the message, this is what could happen to you if you don't obey the rules of the road. But soon, weird things allegedly started happening. In March 1959, the Porsche had reached the third stop on the tour and was being stored in the Highway Patrol Garage in Fresno. For some reason that doesn't appear to be very clear, a fire broke out in this garage which burned 2 tyres and scorched some of the paintwork on the car. And this cost George Barris around $1,000 to fix. So it's not feeling quite as lucrative now. And it gets even worse, as apparently not long after this happened, the 550 fell off its display stand. Unfortunately, there was a teenager who was looking at Little Bastard at just the wrong time as the car landed on him and broke his hip. A few weeks after this again, which, I mean, it's a lot of bad luck in quick succession, just pointing it out there, the car was en route to Salinas. And I just think this Porsche just really didn't want to go to Salinas, obviously. So it was on the road as the brakes on the truck that was trailering the 550 just completely locked up. The driver of the truck was thrown out of the vehicle, but the wreckage of the Porsche broke free and rolled off the trailer and apparently crushed him. So whether you're counting McHenry's death or not, that allegedly is another direct confirmed kill for Little Bastard. After that, there were loads of different instances, according to Barris. At one point, someone had broken into wherever it was being stored at the time to try and steal the steering wheel. He had failed, but apparently also walked away with a cut that went right down to his bone. Which, I don't know, it's a car wreck. It's gonna have sharp edges, and let's be honest, you shouldn't have been trying to steal any part of it, so I'm not gonna give you that one. No, sorry. Apparently, though, it wasn't just people that were trying to get their hands on the parts of the car illegally, though. According to George Barris, there was a guy that called him up on his deathbed, begging George to take back a scrap of metal that this guy had salvaged off the supposedly cursed car. After he'd got this piece of metal, his marriage had broken down and he'd lost custody of his kids, his home had been foreclosed on, and now his health was failing. He fully believed that it was because he had this small part of Little Bastard and was trying to return it to, quote unquote, its rightful owner. I would love to know what happened after this though. Like, did George take the metal bit back? Did the guy get better and his life start going back to normal? Interesting. But that isn't the end of the apparently weird happenings. In Oakland, the car broke into 2 pieces on the freeway and apparently caused an accident that could have been fatal. Then in Oregon, the handbrake on the truck that was transporting the Porsche failed and it crashed into a shop window. And then in New Orleans, the car just seemed to implode on itself. Apparently it just broke into 11 pieces while it was just standing on its display stand. Which, right, the incidences here, if they are all true, they could still just be mostly put down to bad luck. Or dare I say it, shoddy welding on George Barris's part. Like, bits keep falling off of it and he was the one that was supposedly welded it, so what does that tell you, George? And there was a book written called James Dean at Speed, and it was written by a guy called Lee Raskin, who was a Porsche historian, so really knew what he was talking about, along with Tom Morgan. And in that book, they basically came out and disproved a bunch of the fluff that George Barris was spouting, because he was known for inflating the truth, shall we say. Because Barris had claimed that he had been in James Dean's inner circle and he'd been the one to do the customizations on the car, and that he had also been the one to paint the number 130 on the doors and the hood, and then that famous Little Bastard name. All false. He'd never been at any of James's races, and there was no customizations done to his car. Anything he had got done had been to tune it up mechanically, ready for his race, which would have been done by Rolf Wutherick anyway. That was the only condition that James Dean had made about buying the car. And so then you look at the claims he makes about the stories, and already knowing that he's bent the truth to make himself look closer to the story than he actually is, you're kind of already a bit like, really? Are you sure it all went down like that? Because it's not like you're benefiting directly from the legend of the cursed Porsche 550 Spyder by people going to see the remains of the wreckage on this tour. And like, people aren't going to be buying your book to read all about these stories, are they? And so you pretty quickly start seeing all of these holes in the stories of the supposed curse. We do know for a fact, though, that Dr. Troy McHenry, he was running with the rear swing arms from James Dean's car in the race where he lost his life. That we definitely know. But even Eastridge, McHenry's mate who had sold him or loaned him the parts, that day still hadn't changed his mind about the supposed curse. It was just bad luck. Parts fail on cars all the time. And the rest of the curse stories are just super vague and don't really have any evidence to support them. Like, who were the people that got injured or killed? Like, we don't know. Like the fire in the Fresno patrol garage, it had happened, but it wasn't on the date that Barris had said, and the damage was a lot more minor than he'd been claiming, apparently. Something that can't be disputed, though, is that sometime in the 1960s, James Dean's infamous Porsche 550 Spyder, or what was left of the wreckage, would disappear off the face of the planet. It was apparently being transported from Florida to California, and it was stolen off the back of either a trailer or a train's boxcar. Again, the story kept changing, but it has never been seen again. Not even when the Volo Museum in Illinois offered $1 million in 2005 to buy the wreckage from whoever had it. There was a guy that claimed that he knew where Little Bastard was, that he had seen the car get walled up behind a false wall when he was a kid, and he was more than happy to tell them exactly where it was, but he wanted some money up front. Bit sketch. And they never ended up working out a deal with him, so maybe he was telling the truth, or maybe he was bluffing and just trying to make some money. We will probably never know. And so as of today, we only kind of know where two specific parts of the 550 are. There's the engine, which is apparently still owned by the Easterich family. They did sell the Lotus, but they sold it without the engine. Like, no one's seen the engine, there's no proof, but the son claimed that they still had it, so it's just assumed they've still got it. And I'm not sure whether Dr. Easterich himself ever raced with the engine again. Like, that would be interesting to know. Although that's not going to help support the legend, is it? So that probably won't be as widely broadcast, right? So then the other part that has actually been traced back and verified via its serial number with the Porsche factory is the transaxle. And so for a while, this was owned by a guy called Jack Stiles, who was a bit of a Porsche collector. And he actually did an interview with the guys over at Astonishing Legends podcast, which was super interesting into like his involvement and how he got to own the transaxle. And just a side note, Astonishing Legends did a brilliant coverage of this whole story. So shout out to them and their whole research team. Like, they did a really good job. But how Jack Stiles came to own the transaxle of James Dean's Spyder, it was purely by chance. He was already Porsche mad at that point and initially just bought an engine off a mate. It was a spare Porsche Spyder engine, and so he was fixing it up. And then he kind of got to the point where, you know, you kind of need a car for the engine to go into, sort of thing. So we found one. And the guy who was selling it said, "Oh, by the way, the transaxle in this, it's not the original one, unfortunately." I know, such a shame. It's not stock. It's actually from an earlier model. It's from James Dean's car. Okay. So he bought the Spyder, but his engine wouldn't fit, and he eventually sold the car, but he just kept that transaxle. And then in 2021, there was an article that said that the transaxle had been sold at auction. And so it looks like in March 2021, Jack Stiles had approached Don Ahern, another Porsche collector and restorer and general enthusiast. Basically, Jack said it was time for the world to see the transaxle. It had sat in his garage in a crate for long enough. So the transaxle went up for auction and sold for $382,000. And it was bought by a guy with a username Pin Conning. And he actually commented on the listing after he'd won it, saying, "You will soon see this at the Zach Bagans Haunted Museum in Las Vegas. This was purchased for everyone to see. Thanks." Who was Pin Conning? It was Zach Bagans. And so now you can actually see James Dean's transaxle on display in his museum in Vegas. So what about the actual chassis and body? There's been rumblings amongst the Porsche scene over the years that the original car had been found, but nothing's ever really come to pass. And so for now, no one knows where the hulking wreck of Little Bastard is. Jack Stiles had his own little theory, a little speculation, that maybe the Dean family approached George Barris to buy the car back off him, or told him to quietly get rid of it now. Like, not only are they still mourning the loss of their family member, they're having to see this story played out in the press and just be constantly reminded of what happened. Like, that's just not nice. So I can really see how that might actually be a plausible explanation. Because I'm sorry, but if the 550 really was stolen, I feel like Barris would have made a huge fuss about it and maybe tried a little harder to find it and get it back instead of just throwing his hands up in the air, shrugging and saying, "Oh well." Or could it have been, like some people have speculated online, that after a few years touring the country, the wreckage just wasn't drawing in the crowds like it used to, and that it was actually costing more money to haul around than it was making? So then if it disappeared, and especially if it was insured. But no, that's very cynical thinking, Claire. Come on. And so that is about the story of the supposedly cursed Porsche 550 Spyder. And I really do feel like, although this is the part that gets referred to the most, like just the curse, especially nowadays where the era of the films that James Dean was in, they're just not as widely known anymore. So now whenever you see a new article, it will usually be from a car website that will post about it around Halloween, about like this cursed car from a Hollywood actor. But to me, it's just such a small part of the story. Although something that was just absolutely tragic, just to top off this whole big story with just a little bit more tragedy, the car that went on to win the Salinas race that James Dean was heading to was a Porsche 550 Spyder, driven by Jean-Pierre Kunzel. So it wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility to imagine that, yeah, potentially James could have won that race if he'd have made it. And so after his death, Rebel Without a Cause was released on the 27th of October 1955, and over a year later, Giant was released on the 24th of November 1956. James Dean became the first actor to receive an Oscar nomination for Best Actor after he had died for his performance in East of Eden. So that was the one that had came out while he was alive. And then the year after that, the next Academy Awards, he was nominated for another Oscar, again for Best Actor, in Giant this time. And so even now, he's still the only person who's ever been nominated for 2 Oscars after they have died, which really just gives you an indication of like the career that could have been stretching out in front of him. Obviously, no one knows what's going to happen in the future, but if he had have lived, I think he probably still would have become a household name decades later. In 1960, he was commemorated with his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, because like his influence was still being felt, even through just those 3 movies that he got to star in. One thing that I found though, and it really just did not sit right with me, it was from one of James Dean's old friends. The year after he died, in 1956, Mila Nurmi and Jack Simmons, you remember those two, they would always like cruise around in the hearse. Well, Mila and Jack attended a Halloween costume party. Mila went dressed up as a witch, okay, fine. Jack Simmons, he went in jeans, had a leather jacket, white t-shirt on, and a pair of those Coke bottle glasses that James Dean wore. And he had his head all bandaged up. He went to this Halloween party as his dead friend, James Dean, after the crash. And man, like that would have been like just over a year at that point that he had died. Like, I just didn't think that was super cool. Although maybe Jimmy would have found it funny. I don't know. I was just quite shocked that Jack Simmons would have done that and that Mila Nurmi would have been okay with it, considering how close they were at one point. Like, I know by the end of it, they kind of had a few like little goes at each other. It wasn't like a full out argument, but they definitely weren't as close as they had been before. But even so, like, I don't know. And so there's one last thing that I wanted to talk to you about here, because obviously James Dean was a superstar. He was recognised around the world for his films, and his fatal crash shocked absolutely everyone. There's gonna be ghost stories, right, of James Dean himself. You're right. And the first place that people have claimed to experience James Dean is at his grave, which is in Fairmount, Indiana, on top of like a little hill. Obviously, James Dean was a smoker, so apparently if you leave an unlit cigarette on his grave and then you walk away and come back to it, it will be lit and the smell of smoke will be in the air, or the cigarette might have just completely disappeared and is nowhere to be seen. Some people have also claimed to see the apparition of Jimmy sitting on his grave. And the section of highway where the crash happened, that's also supposed to be haunted now too. Some people have claimed to see the Spyder in its former glory being driven by James Dean, speeding along the road. Other people have reported that they've seen him at the side of the road where the crash happened. And so while I wanted to mention these sort of ghost stories, they are all kind of like your standard issue word of mouth legends, right? When people know that something tragic happened in an area, especially to a celebrity, those sorts of stories get reported, right? But there was one story, and it was in the comments on a website, completely unverified. It was just someone's personal experience, but it does sound, I don't know. I'll tell you and you can make your own mind up about it. The commenter starts by saying that her daughter and family were driving south from Salinas. The daughter was driving, she was 27 and didn't really know who James Dean was, bit before her time, not really into that scene. Her boyfriend and their 2 kids were in the car asleep, and it was like 4 a.m, so it was like pitch black outside, driving along the road. It's quiet, so the daughter kind of gets a little drowsy and starts dozing off at the wheel. All of a sudden, she slams the brakes on, waking the boyfriend up, who's like, "Are you good? Like, what's just happened?" She swears up and down that there was a person walking in the road. Obviously, there was no one there. And the boyfriend was a bit like, "It's pitch black. There's nothing around for miles. It's impossible for someone to be crossing out here." Turns out, though, she was right on the stretch of the road where James Dean's fatal collision happened. The commenter goes on to speculate that her mother, who had passed away at this point, was a huge fan of James Dean's. And so maybe she had sent Jimmy to go and keep the commenter's daughter, so her granddaughter, awake while she was driving down that way. And so obviously there are so many angles where you could come and explain this one away, like some sort of sleep-induced hallucination, but who knows? Maybe it was James Dean coming back in death to keep a family safe on the same stretch of road where he lost his life. And so while the stories of James Dean's untimely death and cursed Porsche continue to be talked about year after year, usually around Halloween time, the story of this young star's life is just as important and gives people more of an insight into the person behind the rebel. But as always, I want to know what you think. Is there anything to this curse? Or has it all been sensationalized, blown out of the realms of reality because of who the car belonged to? Because doing the research for this story really changed my entire perspective, and everything I thought I knew was just wrong. When I first started the research, I thought I was gonna just give it like a quick insight into James Dean's life, obviously like his films, his love of racing, and then the inevitable crash, and then talk all about this curse. But what I found when I was researching his life was just so many breadcrumbs into this guy and all his behaviors and interests that it kind of seemed inevitable that he was going to die young. And it was almost like he knew it, like he wanted to be in control of that ending. But it also gave me a much bigger appreciation for the man behind the films and the obvious crash. Like, he wasn't just the devil-may-care rebel without a cause with his brooding looks and go-fast cars. He was goofy. He was silly. He loved life in his own carefree, let's be honest, sometimes reckless way. And if anyone can take any consolation out of this whole sad story, it's that he died doing something that he absolutely loved. As for the curse, nah, I don't think it's cursed. I think almost all of the stories from George Barris were distorted or exaggerated, so I have a really hard time believing a word that he says. Because look at it, it kept people talking about the car decades after. I mean, look at the video that you're watching now. Case in point, accidents happen all the time. And accidents happen on racetracks all the time too. It was just really unfortunate that Dr. McHenry lost his life. But I don't think it was anything to do with the paranormal, the curse, or anything. And to be honest, even with the disappearance of the car, I'm inclined to agree with Jack Stiles, who owned the Transaxle, his kind of speculation on what really happened. That either the Dean family asked for it to disappear, or the side I'm leaning more towards, it was costing Barris too much money, so he did away with it on the down low. But please do let me know what you think. And did you enjoy this story? I did something a little bit different with the editing this time. Hopefully it paid off. But maybe you'd want to give this video a little like for me. Give me a little boost of dopamine that will make the hours of researching, recording, and editing pay off. And if you really like it and you want to stick around for another video, you might want to subscribe too. But that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more next week. And I'm going to leave you with some gold star advice from Mr. Jimmy Dean himself.
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine. You know?
So until next time, drive safe, but of course, sleep safe. James Byron Dean was born on the 8th of February, 1831. Nope. James Byron Dean was born on the 8th of February, 19...